Imagine a digital asset designed to be unchangeable, resilient, and free from central control. Now imagine a civil war erupting over its fundamental rules. That's not a hypothetical, that's precisely what happened to Bitcoin. Today, we're diving deep into the Blocksize War, a pivotal 2-year conflict from 2015 to 2017 that ultimately determined who truly controls Bitcoin's protocol rules and, by extension, its very future.
Right.
This wasn't just a technical disagreement. It was a battle over ideology, power, and the foundational spirit of a revolutionary new form of money.
Absolutely. And our mission on this deep dive is to unpack the intricate layers of this battle. We'll try to move beyond just the surface level arguments about, how much data a block could hold. We want to get into the deeper philosophical clashes that really define that whole era. You'll gain, hopefully, a clear understanding of the key players, their motivations, the competing proposals, and those critical moments that almost led Bitcoin to a catastrophic failure. We want to help you see not just what happened, but why it mattered so profoundly and the lasting impact it continues to have on Bitcoin today.
Okay, let's try and unpack this. Maybe an analogy helps. Imagine a community building a brand new city. Everyone agrees on the grand vision, a new independent metropolis, right? But then they start fiercely debating the size of the roads. Do you make them super wide now to accommodate massive future growth, ensure smooth traffic, maybe attract more businesses quickly? Or do you keep them narrow, maintain a specific kind of decentralized, resilient structure, maybe more walkable, even if it means some initial congestion, some traffic jams? That's fundamentally the heart of our story here. So let's start at the beginning. Bitcoin launched, and pretty early on, it had this 1 megabyte block size limit. It was a technical constraint, right? Hard-coded in the software.
Yeah, exactly. It was added in July 2010, so not right at the genesis, but fairly early. It was almost like an unwritten law for a while.
Yeah.
Few people really noticed it or debated it in those very early days.
And was there a clear reason given? Did Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator, say, this is the limit, full stop?
Well, that's where it gets interesting, isn't it? It really highlights the ambiguity that ended up fueling so much of the conflict later on. Satoshi, Bitcoin's pseudonymous creator, actually offered somewhat conflicting ideas on this.
Okay. How so?
Well, on one hand, he definitely envisioned Bitcoin handling massive transaction volumes. He talked about Visa-level scale. That clearly implies a need for scalability for bigger blocks eventually, right? He even outlined a simple way to phase in a larger limit as the network grew.
Oh, really? Like a specific plan?
Yeah, he wrote this little code snippet suggestion. It can be phased in like
Yeah.
block number 114,000 max block size, 8 equals larger limit. Seems pretty straightforward.
Okay. Yeah. Sounds like he anticipated growth.
But on the other hand, he also strongly cautioned against making incompatible changes. He specifically said about one patch, don't use this patch, it'll make you incompatible with the network to your own detriment. So scale up, but don't break things. Exactly. And that ambiguity became fertile ground for conflicting interpretations. It was almost like different factions studying, religious texts to justify their very different positions on how Bitcoin should evolve.
You can see how that would cause problems down the line. So fast forward to 2015, Bitcoin's getting more popular. What happens?
Well, just as you'd expect with growing popularity, those 1 megabyte blocks started to consistently fill up. Blocks were hitting the limit.
And what did that mean for users, practically?
It meant delays. Transactions were becoming slower to get confirmed because there just wasn't enough space in the next block. And more importantly for many, transaction fees started to rise. You had to pay more to get your transaction included quickly.
Right, supply and demand for block space.
Precisely. And for some, particularly early Bitcoin developers like Gavin Andresen and Mike Hearn, this wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a looming crisis.
A crisis. That sounds dramatic.
Well, they genuinely feared it would cripple Bitcoin's potential. Yeah. They saw Bitcoin primarily as a cheap global payment system. High fees and slow confirmations. That directly threatened that vision. They worried it would drive potential users away to, other systems.
Okay, so they see a problem. What do?
They take a very decisive and controversial step. In August 2015, Gavin Andresen and Mike Hearn launched Bitcoin XT.
XT. Okay, what was that?
Bitcoin XT was an alternative software client. And this wasn't just a minor bug fix or update. It was a proposal for an immediate hard fork.
A hard fork. That means a fundamental change, breaking compatibility.
Exactly. A hard fork creates a permanent split in the blockchain if not everyone upgrades. New blocks created by XT nodes wouldn't be seen as valid by older Bitcoin software nodes, and vice versa.
Wow. Okay, so what change did XT propose?
It proposed an immediate increase in the block size limit from 1 megabyte to 8 megabytes.
8. That's a big jump.
A huge jump, and it didn't stop there. The plan was for the limit to double every 2 years after that, all the way until 2036.
So a very aggressive scaling roadmap.
Extremely aggressive. And launching this incompatible client, Bitcoin XT, was essentially the opening salvo. This is what kicked off what quickly became known as the Blocksize War. It forced everyone to take sides, run XT, or stick with the original protocol, Bitcoin Core. A profound fork in the network, and definitely in the community.
Okay, so this really sets the stage. Throughout this deep dive, we'll often talk about the two main camps, right? The big blockers and the small blockers.
That's right. Big blockers were the proponents of larger blocks, like the XT proposal. They wanted that capacity increase. Small blockers were those who favored keeping the 1 megabyte limit, or maybe implementing much smaller, more cautious increases. They prioritized other things.
And it's probably worth saying these weren't like monolithic political parties, right? There was nuance within each group.
Oh, absolutely. Lots of nuance, lots of different perspectives within each camp. But their core differences, the fundamental disagreements about Bitcoin's purpose and future, they were stark. And as it turned out, largely irreconcilable.
Let's dig into those core differences then. What was the fundamental clash about?
At its heart, it was this tension between scaling and decentralization. That was the big one. Big blockers prioritized scaling. They wanted Bitcoin to capture market share, to be used for cheap, everyday payments, buying coffee, stuff like that. Their vision often involved a future where maybe running a full Bitcoin node required more powerful hardware, perhaps professional server farms handling the increased data load. Scale first, worry about node infrastructure later, basically.
Right, scale for mass adoption. What about the small blockers?
They had a completely different priority. They stressed very strongly that a small block size was absolutely vital.
Why vital?
Because it allowed ordinary users, people like you and me, to run a full validating node from home on regular computers with standard internet connections. They believed this was the only way to genuinely maintain Bitcoin's decentralization, to ensure the network wasn't controlled by a small group of powerful entities, to keep it secure against censorship or unwanted rule changes.
So running your own node was central to their philosophy.
Absolutely central.
Yeah.
It validated the entire promise of Bitcoin as peer-to-peer electronic cash, controlled by its users, not intermediaries.
So it really boils down to this fundamental, almost existential question, doesn't it? What is Bitcoin for? Is it meant to be a super high throughput payment system like Visa?
Or is it something else? Is it primarily robust, sound, decentralized money, where security and user control are paramount, even if it means transaction fees aren't always super low? That was the core ideological battleground.
And this difference in vision, it seems like it also reflected different attitudes towards time, right? Short-term versus long-term.
Exactly. That's a really good way to put it. The big blockers were very much focused on the short-term user experience, immediate growth. They were genuinely worried and vocal about it, that high transaction fees and slow confirmations right now would drive users away, hindering Bitcoin's adoption curve. They wanted to remove friction immediately.
Get people using it, make it easy.
Make it easy, make it cheap, get network effect going. Small blockers, on the other hand, took a much longer view, decades, even centuries. They saw Bitcoin not just as a payment network, but as a potential new form of global money, a reserve asset, something fundamentally robust and sustainable for the very long term.
And for them, that meant
prioritizing the network's core properties, security, decentralization, predictability above all else, even if it meant tolerating higher fees initially. In fact, some small blockers argued higher fees were necessary in the long run.
necessary. Why?
Because the block subsidy, the new Bitcoin created in each block, decreases over time. Eventually, it goes to zero. At that point, transaction fees would be the only incentive for miners to secure the network. So, from their perspective, ensuring a healthy fee market was crucial for Bitcoin's long-term security model, even if it seemed inconvenient in the short term.
Wow. Okay. So scale versus decentralization, short-term versus long-term. Were there other major points of disagreement?
Oh yes, another critical one emerged around who actually enforces Bitcoin's rules. This might sound technical, but it's fundamental.
Who enforces the rules? I thought the code was a rule.
Well, yes, but who runs the code that matters? Small blockers firmly believed that individual users running full nodes were the ultimate authority. These nodes independently download and validate every single transaction, every single block against the established consensus rules. They ensure things like the 21 million supply cap aren't violated. They are the ultimate check. In this view, miners just propose blocks, order transactions, but it's the nodes that accept or reject those blocks based on the rules.
Okay, user sovereignty through running nodes. What did the big blockers think?
Their perspective was often different. They frequently contended that most work, meaning the miners with the majority of the hashing power, effectively determined Bitcoin's path. Some even argued that nodes didn't really matter as much in enforcing rules compared to the economic power of miners. This was a direct challenge to that idea of user sovereignty that the small blockers held so dear. It implied that if enough miners agreed, they could change the rules.
And tied into the fee discussion, small bloggers had this specific concern they called the death spiral, right? What was that about?
Yeah, the fee market death spiral argument. Their theory went something like this. If you remove the block size limit entirely or make it trivially large, then blocks would rarely be full. Competition for block space would disappear, and transaction fees would plummet, potentially to near zero. And if fees are near zero, especially as the block subsidy declines, what incentive do miners have to actually spend electricity and secure the network? The fear was that mining would become unprofitable, miners would leave, the network's hash rate would drop, making it vulnerable to attack, leading to a collapse.
A death spiral.
So they saw full blocks, or at least the potential for full blocks, as necessary to create a functioning fee market, a producer surplus for miners.
Exactly. They wanted that dynamic competition for block space to ensure miners were adequately compensated long term.
And the big blockers, did they buy that argument?
Largely, no. They generally dismissed the death spiral as a fallacy, or at least highly improbable. They argued that miners are rational economic actors. They would act in their own self-interest to maintain a good user experience, meaning reasonable fees and confirmation times, because that preserves the value of the Bitcoin they are mining. They believed the market would figure it out, essentially. Fees wouldn't go to absolute zero because miners wouldn't let the network degrade. So two very different economic viewpoints on how incentives would play out. Okay, let's talk about some of the key people involved early on. Gavin Anderson, you mentioned him launching XT. He was a big deal in the early Bitcoin world, wasn't he?
Oh, immense. Gavin was seen by many for a long time as the lead developer after Satoshi stepped away. Satoshi even publicly handed over the reins to him, in a way. He had this patient, thoughtful demeanor, very credible. He'd been maintaining the reference client, Bitcoin Core. So his decision to back Bitcoin XT, this incompatible hard fork client, it was an absolute bombshell moment. It carried enormous weight.
He wasn't just some random developer.
Not at all. He even made statements suggesting he felt he might need to throw his weight around to get a block size increase done, saying, this is the way it's going to be, and if you don't like it, find another project, which shows the level of conviction, maybe even frustration, he felt.
And who was Mike Hearn, the other main proponent of XT?
Mike Hearn was another very early and respected developer. He'd done really important work like creating Bitcoin, which is a popular Java library for Bitcoin, widely used in wallets and applications. He was perhaps seen as more of an outsider compared to the core development group around Gavin at the time, maybe a bit more willing to take risks, push boundaries.
So not quite the establishment figure Gavin was, but still influential.
Definitely influential, especially on the technical side. He was a primary driving force behind the actual implementation and promotion of Bitcoin XT. Having both Gavin's credibility and Hearn's technical drive behind XT made it a very serious proposition.
Now, the conflict wasn't just code and mailing lists, was it? It spilled into public forums. You mentioned r/Bitcoin.
Right. The main Bitcoin discussion forum on Reddit, r/Bitcoin, became a major battleground. And the moderator there, known as Thamos, played a really significant role.
Oh, so?
Thamos took a very strong small blocker stance. And in August 2015, around the time XT launched, he implemented a pretty controversial moderation policy.
What did the policy do?
It essentially banned the promotion of alternative clients, like Bitcoin XT on r/Bitcoin. The justification was that promoting clients aiming for a hard fork was akin to promoting an altcoin or a separate network currency, and thus off-topic for a forum dedicated to Bitcoin.
Wow. So you couldn't even really advocate for XT on the main Bitcoin subreddit?
Pretty much. Any posts or comments seen as promoting XT were removed, users were sometimes banned. This ignited an absolute firestorm of fury among big blockers.
I can imagine. Why such a strong reaction?
Well, you have to remember the underlying philosophy of many involved in Bitcoin, especially early on. A lot of them identified as libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, people deeply committed to principles of free speech and resistance to censorship. Being silenced on the main community forum felt, to them, like a betrayal of those core principles. It felt like the very kind of top-down control they were trying to escape from in traditional financial systems.
It created this impossible situation, didn't it? A catch-22, as the source material calls it.
Exactly. How can you possibly reach consensus on a critical issue if one side's proposal is effectively banned from discussion in the most prominent public square?
It must have just driven the two sides further apart.
Absolutely. It led to a deep bifurcation of the community. Many big blockers felt pushed out and migrated to alternative forums, most notably a new subreddit called RBTC, which explicitly allowed open discussion of all Bitcoin-related topics, including alternative clients. This split in communication channels was a really significant wound, making reconciliation much harder.
Despite the controversy and the moderation issues, Bitcoin XT did get some significant backing, right, from businesses.
Yes, it did initially.
Mm-hmm.
Several major companies in the Bitcoin space, like the payment processor BitPay and the wallet provider Blockchain.info, publicly supported Bitcoin XT.
What was their reasoning?
They essentially saw it as vital for the industry's growth. They were dealing with customer complaints about fees and confirmation times. They believed XT's scaling proposal was necessary to keep Bitcoin competitive and usable for their businesses and customers. They even signed a public letter endorsing it.
How did the small blockers view this corporate support?
With a lot of suspicion, generally, many interpreted it as top-down lobbying, an attempt by powerful companies to impose their preferred solution onto the network. It clashed with their view of Bitcoin as a grassroots movement, where consensus should emerge from individual users running nodes, not from corporate boardrooms. They felt Gavin and the XT proponents should have focused on convincing users, not just getting company endorsements. It added another layer of political tension to the technical debate.
Amidst all this heat, were there any attempts to find a middle ground, a compromise?
Yes, there were. Even before XT fully took off, attempts were being made. In July 2015, Peter Will proposed BIP 103.
Peter Will, he's a very respected core developer, right? Generally seen as more aligned with the small blockers.
Exactly. Highly respected for his technical contributions, meticulous engineer. And yes, generally considered part of the small block camp, BIP 103 was his attempt at a compromise.
What did BIP 103 propose?
It was also a hard fork proposal, interestingly enough, showing that even some small blockers were considering hard forks back then. But it was much more moderate than XT. It proposed a gradual, predictable increase in the block size limit, 17.7% per year.
Okay, 17.7%. That sounds quite specific. Why that number?
It roughly followed the growth rate of technological improvements, like bandwidth and storage, based on historical trends. The idea was to allow scaling in line with what technology could likely support without overly stressing decentralization. It was seen by many as a potentially sensible path forward.
A gradual increase. How did the big blockers react to that, to BIP 103?
They rejected it outright, particularly Gavin Anderson. He reportedly found this proposal, that 17.7% increase, to be completely inadequate. Almost an insult, according to some accounts.
An insult? Why so strong a reaction?
Because from their perspective, it was far too small. They believed it would still inevitably lead to full blocks, hard fees, and the user experience problems they were desperate to solve now.
So it really showed how far apart they were.
It really did. It demonstrated the deep chasm in their fundamental visions. One side, the big blockers, wanted to avoid full blocks almost at all costs. The other side, the small blockers, saw full blocks as an inevitable, perhaps even necessary, part of Bitcoin's long-term economic model. There was just no meeting of minds on that fundamental point. BIP 103 went nowhere.
Okay, so direct compromise proposals weren't working. What about trying to get everyone in a room together? Were there conferences or meetings?
Yes, that was the next major effort. A series of conferences called Scaling Bitcoin were organized, specifically to address the block size debate and related technical issues. The first one was in Montreal in September 2015, and then a follow-up in Hong Kong in December 2015.
And the goal was?
The goal was to try and bridge the divide through face-to-face scientific discussion, to get the key figures, the main developers and researchers from both sides, talking directly. People like Gavin Anderson were there, Gregory Maxwell, a leading small blocker, co-founder of Blockstream, often called the Bitcoin Wizard for his technical depth, Adam Back, Peter Will, Jeff Garzik, many others. They debated the technical merits, the risks, the trade-offs of various scaling proposals.
Did they try to model this on anything, like how the internet developed standards?
They did. They explicitly tried to learn from internet governance models, particularly the IETF and the Internet Engineering Task Force, and its concept of rough consensus.
Rough consensus, what does that mean?
It's basically a decision-making process where you don't need formal voting or unanimous agreement. Instead, you aim for the sense of the group, a general agreement that emerges from active discussion and addressing objections. Rough consensus in running code is the IETF mantra.
Sounds reasonable. Did it work for Bitcoin?
It proved incredibly difficult to apply when the disagreements weren't just about technical details, but about fundamental principles, competing visions for Bitcoin's entire future. Achieving even rough consensus was a massive challenge. Gavin himself noted the problem. Everyone agreed a decision needed to be made, but nobody knew who or how that decision could be legitimately made in Bitcoin's leaderless, decentralized structure.
But did anything concrete come out of those conferences, especially the Hong Kong one in December 2015?
Yes, something significant did seem to emerge from Hong Kong. While there wasn't agreement on a specific path forward, there appeared to be a kind of rough consensus, at least among the developers present, on one key point.
Which was?
That a 2 megabyte block size limit, maybe as a one-off increase, was probably safe for the network at that time. Certainly much safer than the 8 megabyte jump proposed by Bitcoin XT.
Ah, okay. So 8 MB was seen as too much, but 2 MB was perhaps feasible.
That seemed to be the general technical feeling coming out of Hong Kong. And this effectively signaled the end for Bitcoin XT. Even though it wasn't formally withdrawn right away, its aggressive 8 megabit proposal had lost too much support among the technical community. It was, for all practical purposes, dead in the water.
Okay, so XT fakes. But the underlying problem, full blocks, rising fees, hasn't gone away. What happens next on the technical front?
A really ingenious and ultimately pivotal new proposal emerged right around the time of the Hong Kong conference, December 2015. It was presented by Peter Will again. It was called Segregated Witness, or SegWit.
SegWit, okay, that name comes up a lot. What was it?
SegWit was a very clever technical innovation. The core idea was actually conceived earlier by another developer, Luke Dash Jr., but Peter Will developed it into a full proposal.
And what did it do? Did it increase the block size?
Yes and no. It was clever. It restructured how transaction data was stored, specifically separating the transaction signatures, the witness data, from the main transaction data. This had the effect of allowing more transactions to fit into the existing 1 megabyte block space. Effectively, it increased the block capacity, roughly equivalent to a 2 megabyte limit, maybe even up to 4 MBB in theory, for certain transaction types.
Okay, so an effective increase, but how was it implemented? Was it another hard fork?
No, and this was absolutely crucial. SegWit was designed as a soft fork.
Soft fork, meaning backward compatible.
Exactly. Older nodes that didn't upgrade to SegWit would still see the new SegWit blocks as valid according to the old rules, even if they couldn't fully validate the new SegWit-specific rules. This avoided the contentious need for everyone to upgrade simultaneously, which is the big hurdle with hard forks.
That sounds like a big advantage. Did it do anything else?
Yes. It also fixed several long-standing technical issues, most notably something called third-party transaction malleability. This was a bug that could cause problems for services building on Bitcoin. Fixing it was considered really important.
So capacity increase, soft fork implementation, bug fixes. Sounds pretty good.
For those who understood the technical elegance, yes. It was seen by many small blockers and core developers as a brilliant win-win proposal. Elegant engineering to solve multiple problems at once.
Why was SegWit so compelling specifically for the small blockers beyond the technical points?
Because of its deeper implications for scaling. SegWit wasn't just about getting more transactions into the main blocks, it was seen as a critical enabler for Layer 2 scaling solutions.
Layer 2, like the Lightning Network.
Precisely. The Lightning Network promised to handle a massive volume of transactions off the main Bitcoin blockchain, making them near instantaneous and extremely cheap. SegWit, by fixing transaction malleability and offering other improvements, was a crucial prerequisite for Lightning to work securely and effectively.
Ah, I see. So small blockers saw SegWit not just as a capacity boost, but as the gateway to a whole different scaling paradigm.
Exactly. They saw SegWit plus Lightning as the true path to massive scalability, potentially millions of transactions per second, without compromising Bitcoin's fundamental decentralization by keeping the main blockchain's blocks small and manageable for ordinary users. It fit their long-term vision perfectly. Robust base layer, scalable layers on top.
Okay, so SegWit sounds technically elegant and strategically important for small blockers. How did the big blockers react to it?
With a lot of skepticism and, frankly, hostility. For many large blockers, SegWit's very complexity, its elegance, became its undoing.
How so?
Well, first, the name. Segregated witness. It sounds cryptic, technical, not exactly user-friendly. Second, the technical nuances were complex. It wasn't a simple make blocks bigger proposal. Many people, especially non-developers, didn't fully understand how it worked or why it was structured the way it was.
So they saw it as complicated, maybe unnecessary.
Worse than that, many dismissed it as a stalling tactic by the Bitcoin core developers, or even as an enemy proposal designed to prevent a straightforward block size increase, which was the only thing they really wanted. They just wanted something clear and simple, and SegWit wasn't that.
You mentioned SegWit also fixed bugs like malleability and something about Sci-hash operations. Did the big blockers care about that?
That highlights another core difference in mindset. SegWit did fix critical underlying technical issues. The nonlinear scaling of signature hashing operations, for example, was a potential attack vector. Someone could craft a complex transaction that took a very long time for nodes to validate, potentially slowing down the whole network.
Right, that sounds serious.
It was. Small blockers and core developers saw fixing these kinds of issues as absolute prerequisites. You needed to strengthen the foundation before you significantly increase the load, the block size. Robust engineering first.
And the big blocker.
They tended to prioritize the immediate block size increase above everything else. The bug fixes were seen as secondary, maybe even a distraction from the main goal of increasing throughput now. It really showed a difference between prioritizing long-term network health and resilience versus prioritizing immediate user-facing capacity.
Okay, so the technical debate is raging, SegWit is proposed, XT is fading. Did things calm down, or did the conflict just find new avenues?
Oh, it definitely didn't calm down. If anything, it got uglier in some ways. We mentioned the moderation on our Bitcoin, but there are other things too.
Like what?
Like distributed denial of service attacks, DDoS attacks targeting Bitcoin XT nodes.
Attacks. People were actively trying to take down XT nodes.
Yes, some of these attacks were reportedly very powerful, sophisticated. Some sources claim they were strong enough to take down not just individual nodes, but entire internet service providers, ISPs, in certain regions.
Wow. That's serious disruption. Who was behind it?
It was never definitively proven who orchestrated them, but the timing and targeting certainly suggested it was related to the block size conflict.
What was the impact of these attacks, besides being unethical, obviously?
Well, ironically, they kind of underscored the small blockers' point about needing a robust distributed network. If a relatively small number of alternative nodes could be taken offline so easily, it highlighted the fragility that could come with less decentralization or reliance on specific clients. It showed why resilience mattered.
And the conflict continued to play out in the corporate space, too. You mentioned Coinbase and Bitcoin.org.
Right. Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, was a vocal supporter of Bitcoin XT. In response to this support, Bitcoin.org, which, remember, was originally set up by Satoshi and seen as a semi-official source of information, took the step of removing Coinbase from its list of recommended wallets and exchanges.
Another form of censorship or deplatforming, depending on your perspective.
Exactly. It further inflamed that whole debate, deepened the sense of division and animosity between the factions.
And this was around the time Mike Hearn left.
Yes. It was in January 2016, amidst all this growing acrimony, the DDoS attacks, the forum moderation battles, and the general lack of progress towards a resolution, that Mike Hearn publicly declared Bitcoin a failed experiment.
A key proponent of XT just gave up.
He did. He wrote a widely circulated blog post explaining his reasons, citing the infighting, the resistance to change, the perceived censorship, and what he saw as the dominance of a small group of core developers. He announced he'd sold all his Bitcoins and was moving on. It was a really significant moment of disillusionment, a major blow to the big block movement's morale at the time.
Okay, so XT is gone, Hearn leaves, but the desire for bigger blocks persists. What happens then? Does another proposal emerge?
Yes. With XT effectively out of the running, the big blockers, including Gavin Andresen and another prominent developer, Jeff Garzik, regrouped and rallied behind a new proposal, Bitcoin Classic.
Bitcoin Classic, was this different from XT?
It was more moderate. Instead of the immediate 8 millibit jump in doubling, Bitcoin Classic proposed a simpler, one-off hard fork increase to just 2 megabytes.
2 megabytes. That sounds like the number that came out of the Hong Kong conference as potentially safe. Was this an attempt to capture that consensus?
It seemed like it, yes. A move towards a more achievable goal, perhaps trying to appeal to a broader base than the more radical XT.
Did it work? Did Classic gain more support?
It gained some support, certainly more initially than XT had managed in terms of node count for a while, but it ran into a familiar problem.
Which was?
It repeated a critical flaw from XT's strategy, its activation mechanism. It relied on achieving 75% miner support to trigger the hard fork.
And why was that flawed? You mentioned it before.
Because of the asymmetry inherent in a contentious hard fork activated solely by miner signaling. If you signal for the hard fork and it activates, but doesn't get overwhelming near-universal adoption immediately, then the original chain, the 1MB chain in this case, still exists. And if it retains significant hash power and economic value, it can potentially wipe out the new hard fork chain.
Wipe out?
Through blockchain reorganizations, or reorgs. If the original chain miners manage to mine faster for a period, they can overwrite the blocks on the newer, less supported chain. Any transactions, any mining rewards on that wiped out chain could vanish. It's a massive risk for anyone supporting the hard fork.
So relying only on miner signaling for a hard fork was tactically dangerous.
Extremely dangerous, yes. This was a critical tactical blunder, a misunderstanding of game theory and Bitcoin's security model that the big blockers seemed to repeat. It made their proposed forks inherently vulnerable unless they could guarantee almost unanimous support instantly, which was never realistic. You can find more historical context and analysis of these early hard fork attempts, including the technical discussions around activation mechanisms on resources like bitcoinbytes.org, that's bitcoinbytes.org. They archive a lot of this history.
Okay, so Classic struggles because of this activation method flaw, among other things. Does the big block movement try again?
They do. After Classic also failed to gain decisive momentum, another alternative client emerged, Bitcoin Unlimited, or BU.
Bitcoin Unlimited. Sounds ambitious. What was their approach?
It was even more radical, in a way. BU proposed abandoning a fixed block size limit altogether. Instead, they advocated for something called emergent consensus.
Emergent consensus? What does that mean?
The idea was that miners and nodes could signal their own preferred block size limits. The actual effective limit would then somehow emerge from the interactions of these individual preferences across the network.
That sounds complicated.
Yeah.
And potentially chaotic.
It was extremely complex, yes. And the technical implementation was widely criticized by many developers, including small blockers, as being flawed, buggy, and potentially introducing new attack vectors or instability.
But did it gain support?
Surprisingly, yes. Despite the technical criticisms, Bitcoin Unlimited gained significant support, particularly from a very important player, the mining hardware manufacturer Bitmain, and its influential co-founder, Jihan Wu.
Bitmain. They were becoming dominant in mining hardware around this time, right?
Hugely dominant. Their ASICs, their specialized mining chips, power a large percentage of the network's hash rate. Jihan Wu was also a vocal proponent of larger blocks. Bitmain's backing gave Bitcoin Unlimited a level of hash power support that previous big block proposals hadn't achieved. This dramatically shifted the dynamics of the war again, making BU a serious contender, at least in terms of miner signaling.
This is where things get really interesting, right? The ASIC boost allegations.
Exactly. This is a major turning point in the narrative, around April 2017. Gregory Maxwell, the prominent core developer and small blocker, made a public allegation.
What did he allege?
He alleged that Bitmain was secretly using a patented proprietary optimization technique in their mining chips called ASIC Boost.
Okay. And optimization. Miners want to be efficient. What was the problem?
The problem was twofold. First, it was covert. They weren't openly disclosing its use. Second, and critically, the specific way this version of ASIC Boost worked was incompatible with certain parts of the SegWit proposal.
Incompatible with SegWit? How?
It exploited a specific feature of the block header construction. SegWit changed how some of that data was structured, which would apparently break this covert optimization, making Bitmain's chips less efficient if SegWit were activated.
So the implication was?
The implication was explosive. It suggested that Bitmain's and Jihan Wu's strong opposition to SegWit, which they'd framed as being about technical complexity or governance, might actually have been driven by a hidden financial incentive. They stood to lose a competitive advantage if SegWit activated.
So it potentially recast their motivations from ideological to purely financial self-interest.
Precisely. It painted them, in the eyes of many small blockers, as potentially malicious actors, prioritizing their own profits over the health and progress of the Bitcoin network. Whether the allegation was fully proven or not, it significantly hardened the views on both sides. It eroded trust and made compromise seem almost impossible. It turned a technical debate into something that felt much more like corporate warfare.
With the stakes this high and trust breaking down, I imagine the public relations and lobbying efforts went into overdrive.
Absolutely. Both sides engaged in incredibly intensive PR campaigns, lobbying efforts, trying to win hearts and minds, influence miners, businesses, and users.
What did that look like?
Well, we know the big blockers had corporate support and significant mining backing later on. The small blockers, often feeling outgunned financially, became very organized strategically. There are accounts of them coordinating efforts in private communication channels. One notable one was apparently called the Dragon's Den.
Dragon's Den, like the TV show.
Sort of, yeah. It was reportedly a private Slack channel where key small blocker developers, advocates, and community members coordinated their strategy and messaging.
What kind of strategies did they coordinate?
Things like promoting the benefits of SegWit, countering big block arguments, and significantly, the plan to get SegWit activated on Litecoin first as a proof of concept.
So organized counter-messaging and strategic moves.
Yes. Now, these tactics were sometimes criticized by the other side as being underhanded or secretive, creating an us versus them mentality. But frankly, similar accusations of toxicity, manipulation, and aggressive PR were leveled by both sides against each other throughout the conflict. It was a messy, often bitter information war alongside the technical one.
You mentioned this strategy to activate SegWit on Litecoin first. Tell me more about that. Why Litecoin?
Litecoin was seen as a good test bed. It's technically very similar to Bitcoin, often called the silver to Bitcoin's gold, but with a smaller market cap and arguably lower stakes if something went wrong. The idea, coordinated by small blocker proponents, including Litecoin's creator Charlie Lee, who was supportive, was, if we can successfully activate SegWit on Litecoin via soft fork, it will demonstrate that it's safe, functional, and beneficial.
A live demonstration, basically.
Exactly. It would counter the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt being spread about SegWit's complexity or supposed dangers.
Did it work?
Yes, spectacularly well. Despite some initial resistance from a few large Litecoin miners who seemed to echo the arguments against SegWit in Bitcoin, the community pressure and coordination succeeded. SegWit successfully activated on Litecoin in May 2017.
And the result?
The result was positive. The activation went smoothly, Litecoin's network continued to function well, and importantly, Litecoin's price saw a significant rally afterward.
Ah, so it created a positive narrative, proof that SegWit wasn't scary.
Precisely. It provided powerful ammunition for SegWit proponents in the Bitcoin debate. It showed SegWit was viable and could even be market positive. This was a major strategic victory for the small blockers.
Okay, Litecoin activates SegWit. Does this momentum translate back to Bitcoin? How do the small blockers leverage this?
They leverage it by pushing for a more assertive activation mechanism in Bitcoin. User frustration was growing over the perceived stalling by some miners, especially those aligned with Bitmain and BU.
So what did they propose?
Inspired partly by Litecoin's success and partly by sheer frustration, a really radical idea gained significant momentum within the small blocker camp. A user-activated soft fork, or UASF.
User-activated soft fork, UASF. What does that mean?
The specific proposal was BIP 148, and the premise was audacious, really quite bold. It proposed that nodes running the BIP 148 software would, starting on a specific date, August 1st, 2017, begin rejecting any Bitcoin blocks that did not signal readiness for SegWit activation.
Wait, so the nodes would just ignore blocks from miners who weren't signaling for SegWit?
Essentially, yes. It was an attempt by users, or at least a significant group of users and developers running these nodes, to force miners to activate SegWit. If a majority of the economic network exchanges, wallets, users running nodes adopted BIP 148, then miners would have to signal for SegWit. Otherwise, their blocks would be considered invalid by the economically important part of the network, making their mined coins potentially worthless.
That sounds incredibly risky. A game of chicken with the miner.
Extremely risky and incredibly controversial, even within the small blocker camp.
Oh, really? Not all small blockers supported it.
No. Prominent figures like Gregory Maxwell, for instance, publicly expressed concerns. He argued for using the least disruptive mechanisms and felt BIP 148 didn't meet that test. It was seen as too confrontational, too risky. It genuinely risked splitting the small block camp itself.
So why did its proponents push it so hard?
They argued it was an emergency situation. They saw it as a necessary defensive measure against what they perceived as malicious obstruction by certain mining pools, particularly linked to the ASIC boost issue. They felt they were in a war and needed to take drastic action.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Small blockers accusing big blockers of trying to force changes with alternative clients like XT, and now they're proposing their own alternative client rules with BIP 148.
Deeply ironic, yes. And the big blockers certainly pointed that hypocrisy out, but the UASF proponents felt they had the moral high ground, defending the original vision and user sovereignty against minor collusion. It raised the stakes enormously as the August 1st deadline approached.
Okay, the UASF deadline is looming, creating immense pressure. How did the other side respond? The corporations and miners who wanted bigger blocks.
They responded with a major countermove. In May 2017, shortly after Litecoin activated SegWit and as UASF gained steam, a significant meeting took place in New York. This resulted in the New York Agreement, or NYA.
The New York Agreement, what was agreed?
It was presented as a grand compromise to end the Blocksize War. It was signed by a large group, 58 companies initially, claiming to represent over 80% of the Bitcoin hashing power and significant economic players like exchanges and wallets.
80% hash power. That sounds decisive. What was the deal?
The deal, which became known as SegWit 2X, was a two-phase plan. Phase 1. Activate SegWit relatively quickly. This was the concession to the small blockers.
Okay, activate SegWit. What was phase 2?
Phase 2, the concession to the big blockers, was a commitment to execute a hard fork to increase the base block size to 2 megabytes within 6 months of SegWit activation.
SegWit plus a 2ME card, hard fork. SegWit 2X.
Exactly. On the surface, it looked like the breakthrough everyone wanted. Big blockers hailed it as a major victory. They saw it as a way to finally get their block size increase, and importantly for some, a way to sideline or fire the Bitcoin core development team, whom they distrusted.
But agreements like this often have hidden complexities. Did the NYA SegWit 2X hold up under scrutiny?
Not really. It very quickly began to unravel. It suffered from several critical flaws, both technical and political.
What were the flaws?
Technically, the plan for signaling SegWit activation, using bit 4 signaling, was different from the established method, BIP 9 bit 1, causing confusion and compatibility concerns. The software client developed for SegWit 2X, called BTC1, was developed largely behind closed doors, was perceived as rushed, buggy, and lacked sufficient review compared to Bitcoin Core.
And politically?
Politically, it was seen by many small blockers and core developers as a backroom deal, cooked up by corporations and miners without broad community consensus, especially from the users running nodes. And perhaps most critically, the initial SegWit 2X plan lacked mandatory replay protection.
Replay protection. Why is that so important in a hard fork?
Because without it, a transaction made on one chain after the fork, say the SegWit 2X chain, could be copied and replayed on the other chain, the original Bitcoin chain. You could accidentally spend your coins on both chains simultaneously, leading to chaos and financial loss. This was a huge lesson learned from the Ethereum Classic split.
So a major security risk.
A massive one. Small blockers immediately seized on these weaknesses: the signaling method, the buggy client, the lack of replay protection, the closed-door nature of the agreement. They began intensely lobbying the NYA signatories, pointing out the risks and urging them to withdraw their support. The narrative shifted from compromise to dangerous corporate takeover attempt.
How did the market react to all this? You mentioned exchanges listing futures before. Did that happen with SegWit 2X?
Yes, exchanges again played a crucial role. Platforms like Bitfinex listed futures contracts for the potential SegWit 2X coin, often labeled B2X, against the original Bitcoin chain, BTC or B1X.
So the market could bet on the outcome?
Exactly. It effectively monetized the conflict again. People could vote with their money on which chain they thought would survive or be more valuable.
And what did the futures market signal?
It consistently signaled a lack of strong economic support for SegWit 2X. The B2X futures traded at a significant discount to BTC, often only 15–20% of Bitcoin's price. This undermined the narrative that SegWit 2X had overwhelming support and weakened the resolve of its proponents. It showed the economic majority might not be aligned with the half-power majority represented in the NYA.
Okay, so SegWit 2X is struggling. UASF BIP 148 is looming. What did the most ardent big blockers do? The ones who really wanted bigger blocks maybe weren't happy with the SegWit part of SegWit 2X.
They decided to make a definitive break. Led particularly by figures like Jihan Wu of Bitmain and Roger Ver, a very vocal early Bitcoin investor and proponent of large blocks, they decided to launch their own hard fork.
Separate from SegWit 2X.
Completely separate. This was in response to the threat of the UASF and also perhaps a lack of faith that SegWit 2X would deliver what they truly wanted. They launched Bitcoin Cash, or BCH, in August 2017.
Bitcoin Cash, what was its proposition?
It was explicitly a user-activated hard fork, or UAHF, designed as a direct counter to the user-activated soft fork, UASF. It had a fixed activation date, August 1, 2017, the same day as the UASF deadline. Crucially, after significant pressure from exchanges and the community, it did include mandatory replay protection, making it a cleaner split than SegWit 2x initially proposed. And its main feature, a larger base block size, initially set at 8 megabytes.
8 megabytes, back to the original Bitcoin XT proposal size.
Pretty much, yes. Bitcoin Cash was designed for a clean break. It wasn't trying to upgrade Bitcoin, it was creating a distinct parallel version based on the big block philosophy.
So this was it, the big blockers finally getting their own chain, their own rules.
That's exactly how they saw it. It was their long-sought freedom from what they considered the tyranny of the small blockers and the Bitcoin core development roadmap. It was their chance to finally build and prove their vision. Bitcoin as a fast, cheap, global peer-to-peer electronic cash system unconstrained by the 1 EBI limit or SegWit.
How did the split actually happen? Did everyone just get BCH coins?
Yes, because it was a hard fork of the Bitcoin ledger. Up to that point, anyone holding Bitcoin at the time of the split automatically received an equal amount of Bitcoin Cash on the new BCH chain.
And what was the reaction from the small block camp?
Well, there was a lot of animosity. Small blockers often derisively referred to the new coin as Bcash to try and deny it the Bitcoin brand. But there was also a fascinating dynamic. Many large Bitcoin holders, even staunch small blockers, didn't immediately dump their BCH.
Why not? If they didn't believe in it.
Tactically, some held onto it, or sold slowly. The reasoning described in the source material was to ensure BCH had enough exit momentum. They didn't want it to be easily suppressed or fail instantly. They almost wanted the most committed big blockers to leave Bitcoin and focus on BCH, allowing Bitcoin Core to move forward with its own roadmap, SegWit, Lightning, without the constant infighting. There were even strategic discussions in small blocker circles about not selling BCH below a certain price threshold relative to BTC, partly to make the split financially costly for the proponents, to make them pay for what was seen as an attack.
Did Bitcoin Cash launch smoothly? Did it work as intended?
Not entirely. Technically, it hit a major snag early on. It launched with a fundamentally flawed emergency difficulty adjustment, or EDA, algorithm.
Difficulty adjustment. That's what keeps blocks coming roughly every 10 minutes, right?
Exactly. But the BCH EDA was designed to rapidly lower the mining difficulty if blocks are coming too slowly, intended to attract miners if its price was low. However, it created perverse incentives. Miners would switch their hash power back and forth between Bitcoin BTC and Bitcoin Cash, BCH, purely based on which was more profitable to mine at any given moment due to these rapid difficulty swings.
What was the effect of that?
It led to extremely volatile block times on the BCH chain. Sometimes blocks would come minutes apart, flooding the network. Other times, hours could pass between blocks, making the network almost unusable for payments.
So the very thing it was supposed to be good at reliable payments was undermined by its own code.
Precisely. It was a major technical blunder in the initial implementation, highlighting the complexities of changing core protocol rules. They eventually fixed it, but it caused significant problems early on.
You called the split a financialized hot war. What did that look like on the markets?
It was extraordinary. You had massive speculative trading around the new BCH coin, but you also had what the source calls ideological selling. Many small blockers, seeing BCH as an attack on Bitcoin, systematically sold their free BCH coins every time exchanges opened deposits or withdrawals for it. This created predictable downward pressure on the BCH price. Traders quickly learned to anticipate these sell-offs, front-running them shorting BCH. It turned the ideological battle into this complex, high-stakes financial game fought out on exchange order books.
Okay, so Bitcoin Cash blicks off in August 2017. What happens to SegWit 2x, the New York Agreement plan? Is that still moving forward?
It was still technically moving forward. SegWit itself had activated on Bitcoin in late August 2017, partly thanks to the pressure from BIP 148 and a compromised signaling mechanism called BIP 91 that miners adopted to avoid the UASF split. So phase 1 of NYA was complete.
But what about phase 2, the 2MNB hard fork scheduled for November?
By November 2017, SegWit 2x was completely falling apart. Despite the initial strong corporate backing, support evaporated rapidly.
Why? What caused the collapse?
Several factors. The sustained criticism from core developers and small blockers about its technical flaws and lack of consensus. The clear lack of economic support shown by the B2X futures market. The buggy development process of the BTC1 client. The departure of Bitcoin Cash, arguably removed some of the pressure for a big bloc compromise. Crucially, key signatories started publicly withdrawing their support, citing the lack of sufficient consensus and the increasing risk of causing a damaging split in the community and the network. Companies like BitGo, F2 Pool, others pulled out.
So the coalition fractured.
Completely. In early November 2017, just days before the planned hard fork activation, the lead maintainers of the SegWit2x project announced they were suspending the plan. It was over.
The abandonment of SegWit2x, that sounds like the definitive end of the Blocksize War.
It really was. That moment marked the conclusion of the major battles. And it was, unequivocally, a resounding victory for the small blockers.
A victory not just on the block size itself, but on something bigger.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about keeping the block size limit effectively smaller via SegWit rather than a base size increase. It was a victory on the fundamental question of how Bitcoin's rules are changed. The narrative that solidified was that corporations and miners alone could not force contentious changes against the will of the users running nodes. It became widely accepted, or at least the dominant narrative, that ordinary users who run full nodes held the ultimate decision-making power in the Bitcoin network.
And the UASF movement, BIP 148, even though it didn't technically trigger the way it was designed because miners activated SegWit just before the deadline, it was still seen as influential.
Hugely influential. It was framed as a miraculous achievement in the narrative that emerged. A grassroots movement of users, armed only with code and conviction, standing up to and arguably defeating well-funded corporations and the most powerful mining pools. It powerfully cemented the narrative of Bitcoin as truly user-controlled money, where sovereignty ultimately resides with the individuals validating the network according to the rules they choose to run.
We talked about the financial side. Did we ever learn more about how costly this was for the proponents of the forks, like Bitmain?
Yes, and this is fascinating. In 2018, when Bitmain filed paperwork for a potential IPO, initial public offering, their financial documents became public. And those documents revealed an astonishing detail. Bitmain had apparently invested, or held onto, a huge amount of Bitcoin cash. The source mentions a figure potentially over $888 million worth at one point, and had subsequently incurred massive losses on that position as DCH's price fell relative to Bitcoin.
Wow. Over $888 million.
It was a staggering figure. It really highlighted how deeply personal convictions, the desire to win the war, and perhaps miscalculations about market support could dramatically cloud even supposedly rational business judgment. It turned out to be a very, very expensive ideological battle for some of the key players on the big block side.
And the irony continued, didn't it? What happened with Bitcoin Cash itself later on?
The irony is indeed deep. Bitcoin Cash, the chain created to escape the governance conflicts of Bitcoin, soon experienced its own contentious hard fork split.
Seriously? They split again?
Yes. In November 2018, Bitcoin Cash split into two competing chains, Bitcoin ABC, which retained the BCH ticker on most exchanges, and Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision, or BSV.
BSV. Who was behind that?
BSV was primarily championed by Craig Wright, the controversial figure who claims to be Satoshi Nakamoto, and billionaire Calvin Ayre. They had their own disagreements with the Bitcoin ABC developers about the future direction and block size limits for BCH.
So the very dynamic they criticized in Bitcoin played out amongst themselves.
Exactly. For small blockers, this was powerful vindication. It seemed to prove their argument that diverging from Bitcoin's established rules and governance model, that strong shelling point or focal point that everyone agrees on, inevitably leads to continuous fragmentation, instability, and endless internal power struggles.
Looking back at the whole 2-year war, what are the biggest implications? What did it demonstrate about Bitcoin?
I think the biggest takeaway is Bitcoin's incredible resilience. It faced an existential internal conflict, driven by some of its earliest developers, backed by major companies and miners, and it survived. Not only survived, but arguably came out stronger, with a clearer sense of its governance model. It cemented the idea that changing Bitcoin's fundamental rules is extraordinarily difficult. This isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's what protects Bitcoin from capture, from external pressures, from arbitrary changes. The war was a victory of narrative as much as technology. The narrative of user-controlled, decentralized sound money proved more resilient and ultimately more valuable to the market than the narrative of cheap, centralized payments.
What an incredible story. An epic journey, really, through a foundational conflict in Bitcoin's history. We've unpacked the clash of visions, the technical innovations like SegWit, the political maneuvering, the community splits, the sheer willpower on both sides.
Absolutely.
And hopefully this deep dive into the block size war shows you, the listener, that the core values often associated with Bitcoin, things like decentralization, censorship resistance, user sovereignty, these weren't just theoretical ideals written down in a white paper. They were hard-won realities, forged, tested, and ultimately solidified in the crucible of intense conflict. Understanding this history, this trial by fire, is absolutely crucial, I think, to grasping Bitcoin's unique resilience and why it holds such a distinctive place in the financial world today.
So what does this all mean as we look forward? The block size war, you could say, bought Bitcoin time. It solidified its governance model against powerful internal pressures. But as we've seen throughout history, conflicts often repeat themselves, maybe in different forms. The question remains, doesn't it? When the traditional financial and political establishment eventually truly realize the disruptive potential of user-driven sovereign money and inevitably decide they don't like it, will Bitcoin's hard-won resilience forged in this internal war be enough? Will it be enough to withstand the next, potentially even greater external challenges? That's something to ponder, I think, as you continue your own journey of discovery into Bitcoin. And maybe check out resources like bitcoinbytes.org again, bitcoinbytes.org for more on this fascinating history.